Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Cherry Chunks. And we're gonna pick up where we left off with the chapter of Howling. Now, I may not be a smart VTuber, but I have a sneaking suspicion it might have to do with werewolves, possibly, because werewolves also exist in the typemoon universe. All right, let's continue to the next episode. Chapter 10, Howling. This everyday tale started like any other. The morning sun already alerted Shojiro that day a work lay ahead. Specifically, the gardens needed tending to, and an unkept garden made for an unhappy Shojiro. Luckily, today was his day off from all his part-time jobs. It was a perfect opportunity to get his hands dirty. There was one problem, however. The mansion's grounds were vast. Not only had the courtyard been left to run wild, but the area around the front door had been neglected too. To tend to these problems thoroughly, he would have to work on them week in, week out. In an ideal world, his task would only take a day, but for its enormity. For the moment, Shojiro decided to set foot into the mansion's wilderness and evict the weeds. Wasting none of the early light, he started to tackle the ones around the mansion. By his estimation, he needed to clear the courtyard and the backyard, and then take a small rest. It was just before noon in the sunroom. Alice had come down, book in hand, to find Aoko sitting down with a fashion magazine and an elegantly sipping tea. Through the window, she could see the crouched figure of Shojiro shuffling by.
朝からやってるみたいよ。起きてカーテンを開けたら、もうあの格好でスパスパやってたから。ついでに焼却炉の掃除も言いつけといたけど、いいでしょ？いいけど、頑張るのね彼。外はあんなにも寒いのに。
Alice quietly sat down. Her teacup had been placed on the table for her. She poured herself some tea and proceeded to open her book. The two sat passing the time in silence. Having happened to the same idea, a nice relaxing cup of tea in the sunroom. With their evening roles decided, there was no need for idle chatter. Aoko stared at the window, intermittently turning her gaze to her magazine. Alice was immersed in a book on rune magecraft, occasionally tilting her head as if to recall something. As if by some unspoken agreement, in unison, they pressed their teacups to their lips and glanced outside. To the two girls, Shojiro appeared as if he was an animal in a zoo. Neither was interested in lending a hand. Despite his sluggish movement, he was making good progress. As Aoko's attention turned back to the sunroom, her eyes met Alice's. Alice returned her gaze to the book, though moments later she raised her head again. Clearing her throat, she attempted to focus on reading. It was no surprise that Alice admired Shojiro's diligence. Not even 30 minutes had passed before he had cleared the courtyard of its unsightly weeds. Without stopping once, the mysterious gardener left the courtyard, puffing clouds of white breath. The area left behind was spotless.
プロかしらねあいつ。
Alice muttered after scanning over his work. A stalwart Shojiro worked competently and ceaselessly. She was impressed, like she was watching a scene from a great movie, but before long she grew irked. Why would he waste his energy like that, she thought. Because Alco, not everybody's lazy. Alice looked at the clock.
焼却炉。今から手入れをしたら夕方ね。そっちはもう終わってるわ。朝上から見てたもの。壊されちゃいけないからあれこれ指示出してね。いやー、窓開けて散々となったから部屋が冷えること冷えること。
It was safe to assume Alco had come to the sunroom to escape her cold room. Between barking orders from a window and cleaning in the cold, it was clear who had the hardest job.
しずきくん、何か言ってこなかった？言ってたけど、よく聞こえなかったわ。
In other words, his complaints fell on deaf ears. With nothing else to discuss, the two resumed their reading. The ever so tense silence was broken by Shojiro entering the house after finishing his cleaning. He stared at the two of them displeased.
あったかそうだね、青崎。
外よりは幾分ね。廊下の気温は外とあんまり変わらないけど。それでどうして庭の掃除なんて始めたのよ、宗十郎。
Shojiro's subtle jib had failed to find its target. He had no chance of winning, and so he hung his shoulders in defeat.
今日は本当に寒い。明日あたり雪でも降ってくるだろうから、外の掃除は早くに済ませたかったのに、焼却炉は予定外だったぞ。
He sounded resentful, but his problem was not with the additional work. If anything, he was glad to do it. But he did not care for how nobody would even bother to lend a hand.
いいじゃない。焼却炉はみんな使うんだから。じゃ、その首相な心がけついでに2階の廊下に掃除機かけといてね。それと裏庭のブナの添え木壊れかけてたでしょ。工具箱はあんたの部屋に置きっぱなしだからそれを使うこと。で、全部終わったら私の部屋に来てくれる？いらないものまとめておくから焼却炉で焼いておいて。
Hence why she made him clean the incinerator. Cruel but clever.
それで青崎、君は何をするんだ？
そうね、やることもないしギターにでも触ってようかしら。
Alco thought hard about how to spend her afternoon. Yet the thought of cleaning did not cross her mind as that has always been the case. No, it was not out of spite that she did not think to help clean. It was because the word cleaning was not in her vocabulary. Sojiro knew exactly why the mansion was in such a state it was in. Still, that did not change the fact that the corridor upstairs was very long. And Alco was not lying about how cold it was inside, and that was not much different than outside. You really have no intent.
あくまで掃除をする気はないんだな、青崎。まあ、掃除はしたいからするけど、こう、なんだろう。一緒に住んでる人間をそこまでこき使って、良心は痛まないか？それとも、割と気づいてはいたけど、良心そのものがないのか？
As usual, he might have gone too far. His remarks had hit too close to home. Alco closed her magazine and turned to face him. Infuriated, she glared, her sharp blue eyes piercing into him. Shojiro knew he had not said anything unjust, but he always backed down first.
宗十郎、何度も言うようだけど。
はい。
He replied automatically, straightened his back in response to Alco's cold, calm tone.
勘違いはしないで。私たちはあんたを同居させてあげてるんじゃない。これ以上ないって譲歩の末、仕方なく飼ってあげてるだけなんだからね。
Alco did not mince her words. Shojiro nodded in defeat.
そうか。飼ってもらってるのか。
そう。番犬にもならないだろうけど。
Alco responded, almost tired of the conversation. While Shojiro had little room to counter, he still tried.
しかし一方、番犬は間違っても自分の食いぶちを入れたり、 天津さえ家賃を払ったりしないのも事実であった。
なんか言った？
いや、負け犬の遠吠えを少しばかり。
He raised his hand dismissively, knowing he could not win. To Alco's ears, his attempt at self-deprecation sounded facetious.
宗十郎、あんた本当に分かってる？
そうだな。君たちがどうあっても掃除をする気がないぐらいはな。
Alco grinned at her pet's obedience. As long as he knew his place, that's all that mattered to her. She seemed to be extremely satisfied with his response.
余裕あるんだ、しずきくんってば。
Her playful smile darkened, as did Shojiro's expression.
青崎、なんだか息ができないんだけど。
このまま放っておくとそんなことも言ってられなくなるんだけど、試してみる？
He shook his head, his expression growing more and more grim.
懸命ね。私も窒息したいなんて見たくないもの。
The grating sound subsided. Sojiro gingerly touched his throat. The collar that had suddenly tightened around his neck returned to its normal size.
気管が塞がれた時の苦しさを知らないんだろう、青崎は。本当に抵抗できなくなるんだぞ、あれは。
だからそのための首輪だって言ったでしょ。今まで実践したことなかったし、あんたは相変わらず危機感ないし、ここらで一度しつけておいたの。それより掃除急がないと日が暮れるんじゃないの？
はあ、分かったよ。結局今日はこうなる星の運びだったんだ。
Sojiro left the sunroom, his shoulders slumped and his tail between his legs. Alco watched him leave, returning to her magazine as if nothing had happened. Alice paid no attention. None of that had mattered anything to her. Oh, none of that had anything to do with her. With Sojiro gone, the room once again fell silent. As the clock ticked in, Alice suddenly stopped flipping through her book.
ねえ、どうして彼を酷使するの？
She asked as though talking to herself. Alco replied without so much as looking up.
別に。最後には記憶を消させてもらうんだから、楽しかったら困るじゃない。
Obscure as ever, sincere in her own way.
そう。言われてみればそうだったわね。
Alice could not believe she had forgotten about the situation. Silently, she looked at her book and gazed outside once again. The courtyard through the window reminded her of where she lived a decade ago. Nothing could compare to the beauty of those gardens. But if that was the case, why did the scenery make her feel nostalgic? All Shojiro had done was take care of the gardens with the goodness of his own heart. If only half a day he had achieved so much. It was Christmas Eve and the snow had started to fall. The timing was too good, as though it waited for that day specifically. The cold, bustling main street seemed bright and vibrant in a layer of frosty white. Reindeer statues illuminated the surroundings. Children danced merrily to jingle bells. People walked along the brick road, smiling broadly. These festivities, however, had not reached the mansion on the hill. Silence enveloped the isolated building. The shadow of the snow-covered woodland grew longer. Beckoning in the darkness, people returned to the warmth of their homes, knowing a bitter night lay ahead. Something had been amiss in the mansion all day. Perhaps it was the calm before the storm. 2 days had passed since Toko Awazaki revealed herself. Aoko and Alice spent more time locked in their rooms. Mealtimes had grown noticeably quieter. With their roles decided, they were too busy with their own jobs to worry about each other. On this day, the two had been relaxing in the drawing room since the morning. The mood was calm. Well, mostly at least. Shojiro was fretting that tonight would be the same.
雪が明日ならよかったのに。
He aimed his words towards the girls on the sofa, despite knowing that they would be ignored. Whether the snow fell today, tomorrow, or not at all did not affect them. The snow just meant a white Christmas. Alco remained silent. She wasn't ignoring him per se, she just had another thing on her mind. Shojuro knew this, but he still cast a lonely glance around the sunroom. The courtyard he had cleaned up only a few days ago was hidden by a layer of white. The falling snow would stop every so often, but then resume as if it teased Shojuro. By the next morning, the courtyard would be a winter wonderland. Alco and Alice sipped the tea in an effort to fight the cold. In fact, that was all they were doing.
そういえば、瞳子さんの髪の色は青崎より濃かったね。あんな綺麗な赤毛は初めて見た。短くしてるのはもったいなかったな。
Shojuro rambled on, not expecting a response. However,
短かったって姉貴の髪が？
Alco's expression went from nonchalant to the usual sharpness.
それどういうこと？短くしてるって髪の毛のことよね。
ああ、アリスより短かったけど、それがどうしたんだ？
別に、あの人前は私より長かったってだけ。そう、あの髪を切ったのね、姉貴は。
Alco spoke in a grave tone. Showing slight interest, Alice turned to Shojuro.
普通じゃないな。髪を切ったぐらいでどうしたんだ一体。瞳子さんの髪が短いと青崎が困るのか？
まあその通りだけど。いいわ、どうせ夜まで暇だし説明ぐらいはしてあげる。あんたがそんなこと言わなければ未知数のまま瞳子と戦う羽目になっただろうし。
Alco knowingly glanced at Alice. Her expression suggested she was treating her. She was also likely seeking approval. Alice remained stoic as ever, her expression showing neither approval nor disapproval.
簡単に言うと、魔術師にとっては髪の毛も武器ってことよ。昔から人間の髪や目は魔術の材料になりやすいの。女の場合はことさらにね。瞳の色は多いほどいいし、髪も長いほど質がいい。髪の毛は自身と同一視しやすいし、長い年月をかけて育てられる原始的で強力な原料と思ってくれていいわ。私が髪を伸ばしてるのはまあそういうこと。手入れが大変なんだけど、そこは女だから。
Shojuro glanced furtively. I like that I do not know words. Words are hard. Furtively at Alice, wondering if the same held true for her. Maybe Alice had cut it because it was a hassle to maintain. It sounded stupid, but then again, it was Alice. Shojuro nodded to himself.
ん？じゃあ青崎としてはいいことじゃないか。瞳子さんの髪短いんだから。
それがここに来る前に使い切ったものならいいんだけど、伸ばした髪にはいろいろと使い道があるのよ。私は瞬間的な術の強化にしか使えないけど、姉貴だったら高級的な術の補佐に使うはず。年月と想念を蓄えた髪は魔術師の分身とも言える。そういったものをね、死んじゃった犬だの猫だのを反言させるときに与えると、術者に服従する使い魔が出来上がるの。生前魔力のなかった使い魔。例えば猫とか犬ね。これらは術者の髪を取り込んで申請することで全く違う生き物、猫の魔術師になるってこと。例えば人語を介したり人間に化けてみたりって行動原理も変わってしまって、大抵は術者に似通った性格になるわ。そうよね、アリス。
Her last words came with a mocking smile. Alice silently ignored it.
じゃあ瞳子さんにはアリスのみたいな使い魔がいると？
そう見るのが妥当でしょうね。姉貴は20年以上伸ばし続けた髪と引き換えに強力な使い魔を用意したってことよ。
The fight at the amusement park. Just the thought of Alice Kronji releasing the flat snark sent a shiver down Shojuro's spine. The oil of the moon had been a unique familiar out of this world.
ほら、そこ心配しない。三崎町をぶっ壊す規模の使い魔なんてありっこないから。確かに長く歴史のある髪を使用するほど強力な使い魔が出来上がる。 けど紙を使った魔術師はそれまで溜め込んできた3中のうちの一つを初めからやり直さないといけない。切った紙はまた伸ばさないといけないでしょ。使い魔を作るのは簡単だけど、そう多く従えないのはそういうことなの。
As Alko spoke, her mood visibly improved, as though she had made a breakthrough.
犬とか猫か。
Tilting his head to the side, he could not imagine a world where dogs and cats were so powerful.
変ね。瞳子さんは人魚師よ。スカイマを作って自分のレベルを下げるのはどうなのかしら。
協力者がいないだけでしょ。青崎のお家騒動に人の手を借りたくないから自分だけで全部やるつもりなのよ。あ、もしかして遊園地の人形って羽木の紙で作られたんじゃないだろうな。
確かに話に聞いた限りだと特注品ね。呪いによる永久期間、両手のギミック、フィンの一撃、執念深さ。瞳子さんでもゼロから作るのは難しいでしょうけど。
けど何よアリス。
あの人は人形に自己を投影するような人じゃないわ。完璧な偽物なら許すけど、偽物に過ぎない偽物は容赦なく壊してきた。青子から見てその特注人形は瞳子さんと同じ力量を持っていた。
まさか遠く及ばないわよあんな。
なら瞳子さんの髪とあの人形は別件よ。あの人が自分の魔力を分け与えたほどの使い魔があと一体はいると見るべきね。
専門家としての意見。つまりその使い魔は姉貴より強い。
そうでないと意味がないわ。人手が足りないというのもあるでしょうけど、だって私たちは2人。
同時制圧も想定済みってわけ。なるほどね。その場合どっちが強い方を引き当てても恨みっこなしよアリス。ま、こと使いまであんたが遅れを取るとは思えないけど。
Alice had never been defeated by a familiar. She sighed at Alko's overconfidence.
青子、たとえ20年間の蓄えを付与したとしても、その器が小動物では限度があるわ。あの瞳子さんが切り札になる使い魔を用意したのなら。
よしてよ。いくらなんでも姉貴はそこまで悪趣味じゃないわ。
Alko and Alice stared at each other. The conversation had returned to the drawing room, but the subject matter was not for the faint of heart.
そうね。けれど人間を追い詰めるのに最も効果的な相手は、瞳子さんが死者を亡者にしていなくてもそれと同格の相手がいるぐらいは覚悟しておいて。
はいはい、分かったわよ。確かに天才ってやつは空気読めないから、どんな生き物の死体を用意してきても驚かないわ。
Alko nodded reluctantly at Alice's directness. Needless to say, Shojiro was completely lost.
よくわからないけど、なんで青崎たちは死んでるってことに固執するんだ？
それは使い魔じゃなくて協力者でしょ。使い魔は基本術者なくしては生きられないものにしないと。それでいて優れた意志を持ち、術者の資格や盲点を補える知性もある。それが一流の使い魔の条件よ。正直な話、それだけ都合のいいやつは死から作り直すしかないってわけ。
Completely obedient and capable of compensating for their mage's weaknesses, Shojiro felt that a familiar was a little different than himself.
さて、姉貴は昔からルーン使いだったから戦術は予測できる。問題の切り札もどうやら使い魔らしい。自動人形もさすがにこの前で使い切っただろうし。
Alko spoke directly to Alice, looking for confirmation. Alice nodded in agreement.
じゃあ予定通り今日で終わりにしよう。この1ヶ月好き放題やられた借りギッタンギッタンにして。
Alko clenched her teeth and balled her fists. It seems like nothing more than a sibling rivalry. In fact, that's probably all it was. Looking at Alko, Shotaro let out a sigh of relief. What happened with Toko and how they reacted to her visit, the atmosphere had been deathly tense. For now, Alko seemed much calmer. He took comfort in the thought that perhaps the sisters would just bury the hatchet. Even if Alko and Toko were not sisters, he would not want to see what would happen if they fought. The hands of the clock turned gently. Approaching Judgment Night, a merciless silence would soon come to mock Shotaro's complacency. As night appeared, two things vanished. The first was the whimsical snowfall. The second was the lights of the mansions on the top of the hill. Alko and Alice were nowhere to be seen inside. Only Shotaro remained. It was the night of Christmas Eve. Though Alko and Alice had yet to find Toko, they knew everything would be concluded over the course of this day and the next. Christmas comes but once a year. It was a singular time for endings and new beginnings. In Japan, the modern holiday dated back only about 100 years and celebrated Christ's birth only in name, with all its latter-day trappings. It was neither a pure homage nor a corruption of the festival that inspired it. Regardless, there was significant increase in the land's mana during festivals. Such charge distortions were a boon to the mage's craft, be it creative or destructive. Toko and Alko sought to destroy the local sigils, which gathered and properly cycled the magical energy in the land and its people. Shotaro was able to gather that much from Alko and Alice's conversation. Toko had already claimed 3 sigils. Only 2 remained. Any further loss would signal Alko's and Alice's defeat. In order to protect the remaining ones, they had to split up. Alko lacked power, so she would need to borrow a poi from Alice and head to the Tokawa sigil, which boosted the which boasted the greatest local energy supply. Alice would go fully equipped to the sigil in Yashigori. Free from the constraints of civilized society, magecraft is most powerful at night. The young witch and the apprentice mage wished each other luck before leaving the mansion. It was almost 10 at night. After the girls set out, the first 2 hours passed quickly. When Alko was ready to head off, Shotaro walked with her to the foyer. Neither had spoken a word to each other. She had departed without showing any sign of fear. It was difficult to tell whether she did not want to get him involved or whether she did not see him a worthy ally in combat. The thought stuck with him. He let out a long sigh, not out of dejection or frustration. It was a mechanical, emotionless breath. He sat on the near-frozen floor, staring vacantly up at the skylight. Moonlight peeked through the clouds. He imagined the moonlight bouncing off the town's powdery blanket and illuminating the night. But he would not find himself downtown. Watching from the sidelines was his role to begin with. His roommates and he lived worlds apart. He could not keep up with them, and he did not show the same kind of will. He would remain on the sidelines. However,
そうか。この手が必要な時はもうないのか。
Shotaro looked up at the moon. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a trickle of sadness. Veiled in white and cloaked in darkness, the park seemed like a forgotten memory. Not a soul was in sight. The night felt far more enigmatic than usual, yet the air was clean enough to drink. Though only a sliver of moonlight peered through the clouds, it lit up the entire world. In these moments, a young girl's footsteps echoed, trampling the still white silence under the midnight sun. The pale moon illuminated the inky blue sky. Only a few street lights and encourageous phone booth betrayed signs of civilization. A girl appeared dressed in black. Against the snowy landscape, the figure of Alice Kononji was unmistakable. Pure black, deeper than even the night, were her overcoat, gloves, and hat, even her hair and eyes. Nothing stirred for a time. Not Alice, nor the white scenery. The world was a still painting of a snowy field. Only time moved, gradually darkening the lights in the park and eventually the nearby homes as well. Yashigori was a more modern and developed town than Mizaki. Through the park was located in the center of the town, it had become a blind spot. It had been overlooked by developers and carried no commercial value. A few houses encircled the park. The street lights turned off at midnight. It was a white night. Even machines were fast asleep.
私が先なのね。
Alice whispered, watching the streetlights slowly fade. She thought she heard a dog howling in the distance. Perhaps it was a howling at the moon. The howl reached deeper into the night than expected. A wolf, maybe? A phone rang. It was perhaps the first time it had hung since Sojiro moved into the mansion. Hung? Wrong? Did it mean wrong? Hesitantly, he picked up the receiver and brought it to his ear. He heard nothing. He felt as he had something to say, but could not think what. Maybe something like, hello, Koronji residence. Or maybe, you've reached the Aozaki residence. While he was deep in thought, a voice light as air came through the receiver.
Shizuki.
Sojiro could barely hear the voice, but it was definitely Alice's.
そうだけど、アリス。
No response. The silence was profound as the night, but for the sound of static from the receiver. After a long pause, Alice finally spoke.
青子はいる。
いや、まだ帰ってないけど。
そう。
With a click, the call ended. Sojiro wondered if she had something to say, but could not respond in time. Slowly they advanced, carving through the fresh snow. There were so many. Where had they all come from? Dozens of feral dogs snarled at Alice, their eyes trained on her. The snow clung to the beast's mangy fur. Their clenched fangs and bloodless eyes had barely rained hunger that might burst forth like lightning at any moment. They yearned to taste the warmth of her flesh, and satiate they hung their empty bellies. To them, the girl in black stood like a lighthouse in the stormy sea. She watched them, disinterested. It appeared that the Yasugori sigil was the key target tonight, not Togawa, where Alko had gone. Alice had always been unflappable, and by the child's play before her was hardly about to change that. Her main enemy was not the dog surrounding her, but the lone mage behind them, Toko Awazaki.
ひどい趣味。ここ数年で品が落ちたの。まあ、それならそれで嬉しいけど。これが地金なら、青崎との付き合いもいよいよ白紙に戻せるわ。
Toko laughed at the Arabic taunt.
いやいや、これは不可抗力でね。安心しろアリス。間違っても私の趣味じゃない。
Crunching through the fallen snow, Toko slowly came into view. She wore a moss green coat that contrasted sharply with Alice's garb. A silk scarf warmed her neck. She stood tall, her hair short, striking a more valiant posture than any young man. After all, the two standing here needed to be less than like the shining moon, and more like the darkness surrounding it. The barking abated. Like servants in a royal court, they averted their eyes from their ruler, lest their eyes and hearts be plucked out.
久しぶりだね、アリス。
トウコさんもお元気そうで。
They stood about 12 feet apart. No love had been lost between them. Just two enemies, one who was bound to be victorious and one who was about to fall.
さてどうしようかアリス。積もる話もある。君の近況にも興味がある。そもそも今回の件についていろいろと説明したくてたまらない。5分ほど時間を割いても構わないか？
お断りよ。あなたと5分も話をしていたら。
The following events unfolded quickly. Bodily and without a second thought, Alice pulled out a cat's bell from the seam of her mantle and dropped it. Diddle diddle, the beginning of Alice Kanonji's magecraft, the start of the night of fairy tales. Alcove favored a quick draw approach like something from a western. However, Alice preferred the sleight of hand. She used her target's blind spots against them, ending a game before they knew it had begun. The bell fell like a coin into a fountain. Then, as it was about to strike the ground, it shattered, disappearing without a trace.
ルーン。
ああ、1日かけて公園中に刻ませてもらった。この公園の道はレンガだからね。手間こそかかったが簡単な仕事だった。周りの森まで見て、ざっと400平米のキャンバスだ。面白いだろ？今私たちは30万字以上のルーンの上にいる。
Swallowing hard, Alice took a step back. Toko had carved runes all over the ground. Even in the area Diddle reacted to alone, there was depressing amount of them. Had she truly carved them into the whole park? Alice did not react with surprise, she simply narrowed her eyes. She could see how it would have taken the whole day. It was no wonder Diddle Diddle, banquet of the night, was destroyed by the skin of the sun. Still something bothered Alice.
一体どうやって隠していたの？
There was just so many. What kind of magecraft could do that?
ああ、ちょっと特別性。このルーンね、普段は確定していないんだ。こうしている今も変形している。パッと見はただの傷跡。それが強い魔力に触れると元の形に立ち戻る。そんなわけで、いかなる夜の深さをもってしても、この太陽は没しない。
She spoke modestly, but Alice could not imagine the amount of persistence, technique, and skill it must have taken. And it only took a day. Even 10 mages would have trouble producing so many sophisticated runes in that time. Moreover, these runes were made using unknown techniques that the association had not approved.
負け惜しみだけど、私みたいな小娘一人に大人げないわね、瞳子さん。
バカを言うな。君を小娘だなんて一度も思ったことはないよ。まあ、私好みの体だと眠めつけることはあったがね。
It happened in the blink of an eye. Alice cut off Togo's denied remark with a deadly stare. The left eye of the darkly clad Ard changed color to an ominous ruby. The speed of the incantation was phenomenal. Alice's mystic eyes of enthralling snared Togo. She had been the one to quite literally be taken captive by the girl's stare. Togo tried to raise her arm but could not even move a finger. Alice's mystic eyes commanded absolute control with no room for resistance. Only a person's internal organs were allowed to freedom to move. Since their organs still functioned, it was more precise to say that her eyes forbid the target from acting. Alice had played her hand with exquisite timing. It wasn't the speed of her eyes that had given the edge. The deftness with which she wove her spells to exploit the briefest vulnerability which made Alice a different caliber to other mages like Alko. This witch, who lived in the modern area, was more seasoned in magical battles than Toko Awazaki.
だが残念。ディドルディドルが響かないのでは、魔眼のアクロスティック化はできないようだな。惜しいね。あの月目のプロイキッシャーなら、これで私の方はお手上げだったろうが。
The formation holding Tauko began to be swapped. In the blink of an eye, the mage had bested Alice Mystic Eyes. Alice's black outfit fluttered in the wind. She turned so she was not facing Alcove head-on. The mage had recovered through her own Mystic Eyes. At the root of Toko's Mystic Eyes was a spell of Memorize. Most effective when facing their prey, such eyes could mind-jack the target's awareness. It was difficult to resist head-on. However, its face was greatly diminished if the target was not facing their eyes directly, even if it wasn't within range. Moreover, the girl was the last witch of her lineage who commanded a great number of fairy tales. Against Mystic Eyes that projected their effects, simply turning one's body was enough to repel half the magical energy. Like Alice's eyes, Toko's could also disable actions. Alice had escaped by the skin of her teeth. The damage she suffered was the weight of a twig to a forest. She had just had to let the energy pass through. In an instant, a startling chill ran through Alice's body. This was a problem. The touch of death ran up her spine. She glanced at the mage before her as a blue rubber ball flowed out from beneath her overcoat. The stare off grew more intense. Alice glared harder, resisting Toko's Mystic Eyes with her own. Losing was not an option. In terms of raw magical energy, Alice Kodonji's Mystic Eyes were more powerful and advanced than Toko's. Surely nobody could beat her. And yet, her unfiddled stock of magical energy, stifled by old-fashioned values, was no match for Toko's madness. Deeper within her eyes, somehow the eyes revealed a sealed power. Inside the crystalline lens, the mage craft's left iris was a bottomless pit, a Klein cube. Alice winced in pain. The bindings grew in number. So many mystic eyes, thousands perhaps, all fixed on Alice. Pressure, so much pressure. Endless, and Alice knew it. She saw. Incredulously, she saw eyes growing within eyes. Toko had placed opposing mirrors inside her eyes, resulting in an infinite glare. It was the act of a madwoman creating mystic eyes within mystic eyes. She could even control the resulting chaos caused by all the copies. Her insanity knew no bounds. No mage in their right mind would mass-produce so many mystics, the last escape of the humankind so indiscriminately.
やれやれ、これもお気に召さないか。私なりにマインスターの真似事をしてみたつもりなんだが、うまくできているだろう。君の悪路のように希少な神秘で現実をねじ曲げるのではなく、量産した神秘で現実をねじ伏せる。もの自体はただの間が、だがその段数には果てがない。相手がどれほどの魔力抵抗を持っていようと、それ以上の魔力で拘束するだけのものだ。
She wielded power within a limit to disable an opponent. Once she was caught in them, one was changed the concept of infinity. Projection-type eyes had a fatal flaw. Their firepower and formula were insignificant compared to the great artillery of incanted spells, but Toko had torn down conventional wisdom with brute strength. The gun was a pea shooter. She simply needed to bring more guns. A 9mm bullet could never destroy a fortress unless one threw a fortress's mass of bullets at it. The principle was brutally simple, but in the world of magecraft where concepts decided supremacy, Toko's irritative mystic eyes were the perfect weapon. The target would be bound until she closed her eyes. In theory, at least, the effects were infinite. No amount of magical energy could ever overcome it, so it was utterly futile to resist using magical energy. Of course, one way to counter it would be to simply stay out of Toko's line of sight to begin with. The standard tactic against mystic eyes was to defeat the user before they were aware of you. There was, however, another way. It was simpler than one might think.
ともあれ、これで罪だ。何か言い残すことは？
Alice could no longer see her enemy. Toko's infinite eyes had bound her. All she could do is make out a sliver of moonlight, a blue streak tracing its way towards her.
悔いのない人生で羨ましい。
She drew a rune in the air, unleashing a shock wave to tear flesh asunder. The gust became blades of air, Alice's overcoat, and blue feathers filtered all around. Toko felt something behind her and turned. 5 cat-shaped bells were thrown at her feet. And just as quickly as they shattered into pieces, standing before her was completely unharmed Alice Kanonji.
そよ風みたいなルーンね。トウコさん、本当に鈍った。
うつせみか。術者の身代わりになるプロイの話は聞いてなかったな。
ええ。1年のうち365日は役立たずで。どうしてあんなのが古参なのか、私も疑問だけど。
As if responding to Alice's words, the bird began chirping frantically. An anonymous sacrifice. Who killed Cock Robin? Echoed into the night, sung out the tune.
ああ、そんな歌もあったな。だがあれは一度に1回しか殺されない。2度目はないし、あったとしても。
The bird squawked at a very unbird-like death throat. From behind Alice, the blue robin fell from his tree, a victim of Toko's mystic eyes.
本当に使えない。
さて。ではやり直しだ。あとも使えている。これで終わりにしよう、アリス。
そうでもないわ。確かに、今の私にあなたの魔眼は破れない。けれど、Beauty up with wood and clay, wood and clay, wood and clay, Beauty up with wood and clay, my fair lady.
The song came from the depths of the earth, stirring a mighty quake to mark the birth of something gargantuan. Toko needed to throw Alice into an infinite hell before whatever that could be completed, but she was far too late.
Wood and clay will wash away, falling down, falling down. Beauty up with big sun moral, my fair lady.
The ground burst to life, a finger, then another, and another, all rising up like towers. Earth, snow, and brick knitted together, manifesting a giant stone golem.
そんなバカな話があるか。なぜこいつが出てきやがる。
Toko was so angry and confused she could barely gather her thoughts. The bridge giant. The monster from the Meinster's fairy tales rose from the ground, ruining Toko's plan. The giant was extremely powerful but could only be summoned under one condition. It must be in proximity to a natural river. It was the monstrous one only condition. But this park was nowhere near one. And on top of that, it was rising up directly between Toko and Alice mid-battle.
あら、あるでしょう。すぐそこに。川と呼ぶには小さな。すぐに消えてしまうもの。
Toko lowered her gaze. She was standing in a puddle of water. The scarred red mage was dumbfounded. That was why Alice had used Diddle Diddle before. While the bells could be replenished, they were valuable to Alice. And she had spent 5, throwing them in an intentional line for the sun runes to destroy. From there,
雪解けの流水か。
the arms of the Thames troll rose up from the stone paving. The monster's torso alone surpassed 80 feet. Its form was made entirely of stone. Previously, she had created one using the trees of a forest. However, Toko knew instantly the monster before her was at least twice as powerful.
止まれ
She unleashed her stacked mystic eyes. They were meaningless at this stage. They had no effect on the giant. As said, mystic eyes can be countered in two ways. The first is to hide oneself from view of the mage. This was the standard response. The other way, however, was devilishly simple, yet 100% effective. In fact, it's less of a way and more of a fact. Mystic eyes curse a target by focusing on them. However, what if the target was too large to focus on entirely? The answer was, one could barely stop a single arm. The giant, unfazed, raised its right arm and swung it down to the ground, destroying thousands of runes. The demolished stones were absorbed into its arm, adding it to its mass. As the mage had said before, no matter how deep the night, these little suns won't set. While the suns might not set, they could be crushed under the bulk of a giant's hand. The victor of the battle was decided. Toko Awazaki closed her eyes and prepared to escape. The stray dogs began to whine, fearful of the hulking figure before them.
参ったな。私ではマインスターには勝てなかったか。まあ、そのあたりは今後の課題としよう。
呆れた。逃げられると思っているの？トウコさん。
まさか。そこまで鈍ってはいないよ、ハリ第一。逃げるとしたら、それは私の方じゃないからね。
There was no hint of bravado in Toko's tone. Even in the face of the Titan, who had no means of harming her, her confidence was unshakable. The reason being...
ま、前座は終わりだ。来い、ベオ。
This was no longer a battle of skill. A fight for survival had begun. Snap went Toko's fingers. In response to beautiful high-pitched melody floated up towards the moon. It echoed all around them. The spiral howl dredged up ancient primal memories. Its source emerged from the shadow and landed next to the mage. Alice's lip trembled faintly, not from fear, but with admiration as she recognized the creature before her. It was a majestic golden beast, beyond the domain of both magical and phantasmal, simply divine. It was a life that should have passed from the world with the age of gods, a mystic derived from human wisdom preserved by thousands of generations of hidden tradition, a recreation of a miracle that only once freely walked the earth, the natural enemy of magecraft, able to crush it with ease. Quiet resignation settled over Alice's face. The golden beast charged. This time she didn't even have a chance to admit defeat. Woof. She could hear the beast breathing in her ear. It seemed she had been conscious for a short time. Alice opened her eyes and took a deep breath. Each cough sent pain shooting through her body. Blood rose from the pit of her stomach and she spat it out onto the cold ground. When her vision returned, she was able to make out the distant sky, falling snow, and golden wolf. The wolf panted. It stared at Alice, saliva dripping from its mouth onto her cheek. Razor-sharp fangs lined its jaws. Its fur was glossier than any animal she had ever seen. Brutal and knife-like claws protruded from its massively blood-stained paws, and yet it did not smell like a beast. Surely the presence of a noble creature, a human, would feel like a lesser animal. The battle between Alice and the wolf was over before it began. After destroying the troll, it baptized Alice with its wicked claws, giving her no chance to escape. Its simple swipe had torn her abdomen like a sword, carving through her clothes and flesh all the way to her heart. Even so, not once did Alice make a sound. The wolf had her pinned and stared at her face. Her limbs felt ready to break at any moment. In the situation she found herself in, now fully conscious, Alice stared her enemy through pained eyes. She felt no fear, only cold reality sinking in. Sensing Alice's demeanor, the wolf suddenly paused, its paw still raised. They looked into each other's eyes.
そんなに血が出てるのに痛くないんだ。
The wolf's voice came as a surprise. There was no doubt it had
そ
spoken.
れとも痛いのは平気なのかな。
The wolf's voice sounded innocent, almost childlike. In complete contrast to what had happened up to the point, the wolf smiled.
どっちにしろ我慢強いんだね、お姉ちゃんは。
The wolf opened its mouth wide and clamped its jaws around Alice's neck.
ベオ
Toko's tone was sharper than the wolf's fangs. The wolf froze.
トウコさん、
He let go and slowly turned his head towards the voice.
とどめは刺すなと言ったろ。余計な仕事を増やす気か、バカも。
それはそれで楽しいのに。ああ、退屈。話に聞いた橋の巨人も結局は他の生き物と一緒だったし。
The wolf backed away from Alice, as if no longer interested in its prey. The golden beast, she was little more than an old chew toy.
なんだ、もう意識が戻ったのか。心もタフなら体も大概だな。骨まで砕いてその程度の出血とは。
Barely clinging to life, Alice stared at Toko. But not a stare of hatred and defeat, but one of disbelief. Alice simply wondered why Toko had brought such a beast.
ああ、紹介が遅れたな。彼はおそらく地上で現存している最後の人狼だ。北欧の奥地に生きる彼らの一族の中に現れた生粋の原種だよ。見ての通り、先祖返りなんて言葉じゃ表せない黄金の神秘でね。名前がなかったんで、わかりやすくベオウルフと呼んでいる。
ベオウルフ。
Alice's face was perplexed, even though she hadn't wavered when she was disemboweled. Beowulf, the name of the heroic giant slayer from Danish legend. It came from an old English, a combination of honeybee and wild beast, a bear, in other words.
なんでそんなちぐはぐな名前を。
いや、可愛いからに決まってるだろ。
Perhaps because of the name or because of the golden beast itself. Finding the pain, Alice struggled to read Toko. In this respect, she was worse than Alco.
ついでに説明しておくと、周りの犬どもはベオが勝手に呼び寄せたものだ。私自身、今のところは。
Toko's mouth twisted into a grin. Not the warm one Shojiro saw, but the merciless smile a victor displays to a loser. The disdain in Alice's eyes turned to anger. The golden mystic, how could Toko have brought such a creature into the human world?
何？需要と供給だよ。過疎化は人間だけの問題じゃない。彼らもいい加減、昔ながらの生活には限界が来たらしくてね。話し合いの末、高額で私が買い取った。と言っても、あくまで里から出すだけの権利だがね。お察しの通り、私の髪はベオとの契約に使い切った。自分の髪を使って分身を作るより、強大な怪物を縛り付けた方がよっぽど健全。
While she was talking, Toko noticed something strange. An unusual sound. A preternatural sound that tore at the mind. A sound that should not have existed. It was coming from the girl's open abdomen.
もう復元が始まったか。いや、というより。
何この匂い。トウコさん、なんかワクワクすること起きてない？
Curious, Beowulf moved closer, like a puppy examining a new toy.
見るな、あっちに行っていろ、ベオ。正気を失っても知らんぞ。
Toko shooed the mutt away with her hand. Beowulf lowered his head meekly and withdrew.
教育方針を間違ったかな。まったく乙女の腹を見ようなんて恥を知れ恥を。
瞳子さんだって見てるじゃない。
バッカ、私は乙女だからいいんだ。
If Alco had been here, she would have blasted them away for their impudence, just as she did against Blacksnark.
しかしむごいな。こんなになるまで放っておくとは。マインスターは人の親とは言えまいよ。
With her gloved hand, Toko ran fingers around the wounds on Alice's abdomen. A flash of pain ran through Alice's body. Alice had held her screams, but she finally let out a long breath. She turned her face away in pain or
ほ
shame.
ら、もう肌も復元している。骨格、血管はおろか、内臓、生後、肉体に魔術回路を付加することは諸刃の剣だ。呪文と自分を一体化させることにより栄唱の手間を省き、しかしそれは多ければ多いほど苦痛を伴う。青崎の刻印は腕一本分。まあ君に比べれば。
The mage crests Toko referred to were the inheritance of the Aozaki family passed down by their ancestors. They could only be inherited. Alco had received the ones that were meant for Toko.
しかしそれも良し悪しだな。右腕に刻印をした青子の痛みは残る人間の体と神秘となった右腕とが反発する程度だ。通常の肉体が右腕を否定し末梢にかかる痛み、精神的にも肉体的にも生じる幻痛は現在にも似て拭い去ることはできない。だがここまで来ると痛みも何もあるまい。そもそも生きている実感はあるのか？自分が人間だとまだ信じている？ああ、本当にお互い非凡な死を持つと苦労するね、アリス。
Toko took Alice's body into her arms. The wounds for Beowulf had mostly healed. Even so, her breathing was shallow, likely due to the pain. Toko gently held the girl's face in her hand.
マインスターには恩がある。それに私の相手はあくまで青子一人だ。
Wow. 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 Just right in the middle of the park? Ooh, damn. Alice's lungs pained for oxygen. Toko pressed her lips to hers. The young girl wiggled, trying to escape, but Toko held her firmly. Beneath the blue moon, the two remained frozen. Then the sound of swallowing. Ew. Something solid slid down Alice's throat, and with that she went limp and her arm fell. After settling Alice's down on her side, Toko stood up.
今のは七かまどに手を加えた私の特製品だ。そう簡単に解毒はできない。魔力を流せば体の中で暴発する仕組みになっているから。ああ、口移しは私の趣味だから。特に気にすることはないよ。
Wow. As she desperately clung to consciousness, Alice looked up at Toko from the ground. The disgrace from the kiss was greater than the pain she felt from her body. Toko began walking away, her golden wolf in tow. Neither looked back to see Alice's hateful glare.
そうそう、一つ言い忘れていた。ベオが呼び寄せた野犬たちだけどね。公園の外にまだ山ほどいるんだが、困ったことに彼らは本来何を口にするべきかを思い出している。ベオの野生に刺激されたんだろう。獣はより強い獣に従うものだからな。
In a roundabout way, Toko had read Alice's her last rites. In nature, it was common for the weak that could no longer move to offer their bodies up to feed the strong.
じゃあ私は行くよ。歩くことも満足にできないだろうが、無事に帰れるといいね。
With a twisted grin, the mage headed down into the darkness. As her footstep faded, the sound of growls grew louder. Alice could still barely focus her eyes. The hounds looked like monsters out of her picture book. Alice took a deep breath, her consciousness looking away. The sky was blue, the trees were tall, the park was a graveyard. In the corner of her eye, though, Alice could just make out a solitary phone booth. The phone rang. It was the second time Shojiro had heard its voice echo through the cold foyer. Only a few minutes had passed since Alice called. He wondered what she could want at this time. The call persisted, determined not to leave him through his thoughts.
はい、クオンジですが。
あら、その声は宗十郎くん？
A cheery voice, Shojiro had been expecting Alice. It was Toko Awazaki. Somehow Shojiro was not surprised.
そうですけど、トウコさん、暇なんですか？
He checked the time. He thought it was about midnight by now. No matter what the situation, Shojiro always kept his cool. He could hear Toko trying to suppress a laugh. After taking a while to compose herself, she started talking again.
ごめんなさい。ちょっとツボ入っちゃったみたい。で、質問の開始ね。これがあんまり暇じゃないな。私も今日で終わらせる予定だから忙しいんだ。
偶然ですね。青崎もそんなことを言ってました。
やっぱり？そうね。こういう時は本当に姉妹だなって思うわ。昔からエンジンかけるタイミングだけは一緒だったから。ところで、青崎はやめてって言ったでしょ。私も青崎だからくすぐったいのよね。そう言われるの。
Shojiro realized she was probably right. Awazaki's words made more sense
ま
now.
あそんなわけだから長話をする気はないんだ。単刀直入に聞くけど。
It almost sounded like she was worried about her sister's whereabouts. But the cool-headed Shojiro had not forgotten Toko was their enemy. Keeping Naoko and Alice in mind, he decided to be evasive.
さあ、なんて答えてほしいんですか、トウコさんとしては。
The question shifted the tone of the conversation drastically. Shojiro could hear Toko muttering to herself in annoyance. Shojiro was proving more quick-witted than she anticipated. A change of task was required.
そうね。君には何も答えてほしくないっていうのが正解かな。第一印象で君を無視するのは良くない気がしてたけど、やっぱり私は宗十郎くんを手にかけたくはないみたい。君はこのまま無関係でいてちょうだいね。
Her warning came from the heart. Shojiro responded flatly once again, not giving any sign either way. It seemed she wanted him to stay out of this too. Even Shojiro could tell the girls were being kind in their own way. But who asked for this kindness?
じゃあ、さよならね。私は君が思ってるほど暇じゃないから。でも、最後に一つだけ。君を試すようで悪いんだけど、伝えておかないと一生恨まれそうだし。なんで、そうならないように、責任の半分を君に押し付けちゃおうかな。
Toko giggled, a laugh to show that she had him in the palm of her hand from the beginning.
さっきクオンジさんに会ってきたの。彼女から電話があったでしょ。
Her tone had not changed. She sounded as cordial as before. Even so, Shojiro had heard Alice's name, a chill ran up his spine.
彼女、今ひどい状態なんだ。満足に歩けないどころか、体中の刻印が活性化して破裂寸前。そう、まあ、ともかくだ。いつ気を失ってもおかしくない状態なんだけど、災難なことに怖い野犬に囲まれてるみたいなの。個人的な意見だけど、10分もあれば骨しか残らない結末になるでしょうね。
She spoke as if she was telling a joke. If it was a joke, it was in bad taste. However, Shojiro knew this was anything but. She was telling the truth. He had not heard of dogs attacking anyone in town, but the noise he heard on the phone with Alice suddenly made sense. Dogs, a pack of them. No doubt it was surrounding their prey. Why had he not cottoned on? Why had he not caught on sooner? Squeezing the receiver of his hand, Shotaro cursed himself. Alice had been calling for help. Even when backed in a corner, she had not wanted to involve Shojiro. Still, she needed help. The way she had said his name so lightly. He spoke abruptly. Even though she knew Toko was the enemy, he was confident that she would answer him. That was the reason she called.
教えてあげてもいいけど、そうした瞬間に君は私の敵になるのよ。その覚悟はある？
Sojiro realized what was happening. He was being tested. By ignoring Alice, he would be confirming that he did not want to get involved. But if he decided to save her...
それで場所は
Sojiro ignored Toko's question. Of course, he was not prepared to become her enemy, but he was less prepared for let Alice die. He had lost his ability to think sensibly, not that he was particularly good at that to begin with. Still, he would not waste any time in deliberation. He would simply go with his instincts. It was one of the few times he had felt pride in coming down from the mountains.
そう。ちょっと残念だな。私は本当に君が気に入ってたのに。まあ、こうなることは分かってたけどね。場所はヤシロギの森林公園。受話器の下に地図があるでしょ。この前帰りがけにしおりを挟んでおいたから、それを参考にすること。繰り返すようだけど、10分持てば幸運。その後は1分ごとに奇跡の価値が上がるような状況よ。
As he listened, Sojiro's expression turned to one of irritation. Misaki and Yashiguri were one station apart. How long would it take to get to the station from the mansion? Usually just under 12 minutes. By the time he got off the train at Yashiguri, nearly 30 minutes would have passed.
地図の上じゃ近いのに、区画整理された交通手段は不便よね。けど、急げば最終の電車には間に合うわ。ここで諦めた方が賢明だけど、どっちにしたって後悔のないようにね。
The line went dead. Sojiro, not Toko, had hung up the phone. He memorized the map and then made for the door. With no time, he grabbed his coat and ran to the snowy winter night with clothes he had on. All that remained in the hall was the discarded map. It showed Misaki City. It was about 10 miles from the mansion to the nature park. 5 if you went straight in the line, but the streets were not that forgiving. 4 inches on the map, but so much farther in reality. For the first time, Sojiro cursed this town. Alice's injuries were not limited to her abdomen. The wolf had punched a hole straight through her back, crunching her lower vertebrae and leaving her legs paralyzed. Though her magic crest were repairing the damage, it would likely take another hour before recovery. At the very least, her heart and slender arms still worked. Though her crawling along the ground at the phone booth, those too were failing her. The crest sealed the wounds, and a searing heat ran through her that had threatened to overwhelm her. It was as if her body was no longer owned. She was transforming into another creature. The poison throbbing through her wounds hurt emotionally more than physically. She was used to pain, but she could not accept the disgusting feeling. Not that she had an intention to. The moment she did, she would be her last. Alice wrestled the discomfort from her abdomen and her magic crest, and with her consciousness holding it by a thread, she took the phone in her hand. It was unlikely Alko would be there to pick up. Even so, with the stray dogs gathering around the booths, she had to try. It was Sojiro who picked up. Alice knew she was better off than just hanging up, but his name slipped out her mouth. After pausing and fighting with herself for some time, an image of the innocent boy came to mind and she hung up. Her instincts had won out. She could not let him get involved. And not just because he was an innocent bystander, it was more than that. To Alice, Sojiro appeared that day because he was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the lightest of breaths, when only the lightest of breaths passed her lips. Above her, the moon began to blur. Snow was falling again, so close yet so far. The dogs began hurling in themselves at the phone booth, trying to both to chorus and of the hungry snarls, thunk thunk. She took one last deep breath and closed her eyes. Glass, an unusual material for a coffin. But the girl knew in some corner of her mind that she had to make the right choice not to ask the boy for help. Some time passed. A peculiar sight came into view. The field of white flowers, field of wildflowers. The clear blue sky was blue too. The flowers so numerous they made the field look barren. The sight was so dazzlingly beautiful she wished she could look away. This was probably all thanks to Father Winter. The cold wind carried the scent of paradise far removed, untainted by man or beast. It was a glimpse of the fields beyond winter. One could be forgiven for thinking they were the afterlife. Come to think of it, she remembered how funerals were sad yet always beautiful. She cried. She made an incurious whine a sound of life. Her breathing was strained and erratic. Hollow and useless was the heart that she once used to fend off pain. It was as though she was in the space between disconnected body and mind, a crying woman and a silent child. High was the sky, deep was the forest, unmoving were the people. No footsteps or voices of salvation came. Who was that looking innocently up at the sky in the stillness? When she came to, Alice was going up a familiar hill. The cold night air had all but frozen her hands and feet. She shook, as you would expect from someone whose abdomen had been torn apart.
Shizuki.
She could barely comprehend what she was being carried slowly up the Shiro Inuzuka. Shojiro had Alice on his back and was silently ascending the slope. His calm eyes seemed to be suffering from the bitter cold. He did not seem to be dressed for this time of year. Not even a coat. His exposed neck and hands were ice cold.
どうしてここにいるの？
Alice's ass still slumped over his frame. She tried to move, but to no avail. The last thing she wanted was to rest her entire weight on someone else.
瞳子さんから電話があった。アリスが危ないって。青崎はともかく、アリスは意地を張りすぎだ。あの状況で助けを呼ばないのはどうかしてる。
Shojiro spoke with a scolding tone, his eyes kept firmly ahead. His words were directed at himself rather than the girl in the back.
しずきくんは関係ないもの。
だろうね。けど、これで関係はできた。館に着いたら話してもらうぞ。
Shojiro focused on climbing the hill. The slope would get steeper from here to the mansion. The thought of Shojiro climbing up the steep hill with her on her back surprised Alice.
降りるわ。もう大丈夫だから。
お腹をむき出しでかい？この方が少しは暖かいよ。それに、アリスは薪より軽い。山じゃこの程度は朝飯前だから気にしないでくれ。まあ、その意味はなかったんだが。
なぜ？
俺が着いたら、犬はさっさと散っていった。初めから瞳子さんはそういうつもりだったんだ。アリスをどうにかするつもりもなければ、時間制限もなかった。喜ぶべきことなんだろうけど。
Shojiro said dejectedly, but he was wrong. While Togo did not want to kill Alice per se, she would not have cared if she had died. At least that was the way Alice saw it. She did not know how long it took Shojiro to get to the park, but if he had not come, the phone booth would have collapsed and she would have been dead. Alice did her best to suppress her thoughts and feelings. She felt silly at the thought of correcting him, and it would matter little anyway. The thought of her trying to thank him was more painful than her open wound.
もしかして公園からずっと。
仕方ないだろう。電車終わってたんだから。タクシーを使えばよかったんだけど、あいにく持ち合わせがなくて。ほんと、今日ほどお金の不便さを思い知った日はない。
For the first time today, Shojiro let out a sigh. There was no point in taking a break. He had already traveled close to 6 miles like this. Perhaps the fatigue was getting to him. Shojiro was more upset with his own weakness than his difficulty of the task.
でもそれを言うならお金の大切さじゃない。
使えるものがあるのにお金がないだけで使えないんだから、それって不便って言わないか？
The innocence of his question made Alice briefly forget her pain. She too felt distance from the real world. But compared to the boy carrying her, she felt like a regular citizen.
何かあなたらしいわ。
Alice smiled to herself. As Alice rested her head, something soft touched her cheek. The collar that Alco had given him.
館に着いたら着替えるんだ。お腹の血も拭って。落ち着いたら今で話そう。瞳子さんに言わせれば 俺もこれで敵らしいから。
With those words hanging in the air, they reached the top of the hill. A gate in the woods stood before them. Beyond it, illuminated by the pale moonlight, stood in the mansion. Looking up at it, the girl felt a little disappointed. A natural reaction, yet she could not place where her sadness was coming from. Once they entered the mansion, Alice slid off Shojuro's back and walked toward the west wing. The west wing was her domain. However, only after a few steps she collapsed to the floor.
アリス
Sojuro rushed over to her, but she raised her hand. She gestured and told him not to come closer. He stopped in his tracks, but concerned look on his face. Her pale skin gleamed with sweat. Her expression uncharacteristically strained.
平気。部屋に戻るぐらいの力は戻ったわ。服を繕ってくるから。あなたはここにすぐに戻ってくるから。そうしたら。
The pained look in Alice's eyes told Shojuro they would talk later. He knew he could not stop her. Shojuro reminded himself that she was the one in pain, not him.
それじゃあ戻ってきたら話を聞かせてくれ。
Alice took a deep breath before slowly disappearing down the corridor. An uneventful 5 minutes passed. Alice returned wearing a fresh set of black clothes, but her complexion remained pallid. With a small sigh, she carefully leaned against the pillar of the foyer and slid down until she was sitting.
アリス、傷が痛むなら無理せず横になった方がいい。
Totoro sat across from her on the cold floor.
傷はもう痛まないわ。横になる必要もない。この体の異常は七かまどを飲まされたせいだから。
じゃあせめて毛布とか。
いいから気遣いはしないで。
She seemed to be telling the truth. Sotaro remembered Aoko telling him that as long as Alice was inside the mansion, she would be comfortable.
あったかいのならいい。それで七かまどっていうのは
薬草の一種よ。7回かまどで焼いても燃え残ることから付けられた名前で、紅葉は魔除け。普通の人には良くない程度だけど、私や青子には少し厄介ね。体内での魔力生成そのものに抵抗されてしまうから手の打ちようがない。
毒と。
いえ、本来は薬草よ。今は傷を治すために魔力を使っているから苦しいけど、傷が完治すればおとなしくなるわ。魔術さえ使わなければ単純な話、七かまどを消化するまで私は役には立たないだけ。
Alice paused. She decided not to say how many days that would take.
別にしずきくんが心配することじゃないわ。こんなの血が流れる程度の痛みだから。
She worked hard to keep her tone calm. Aoko had barely blinked when she was struck in the back, so mages must have a naturally high pain threshold. Sojuro was fried and bewildered by what she said. If wounds didn't count it as long as the pain wasn't too bad, then nothing would hurt except the injury that killed you.
わかった。話をするのは明日にしよう。今日はとにかく体を休めてほしい。
明日になっても
いいんだ、それでも。アリスはもっと体を大事にしてくれ。
He stood up.
部屋まで送るよ。それとも今で休むか？西館には入ったことはないからアリスの部屋もわからないし。
ここでいいわ。青子を待たなくちゃいけないから。
Alice looked up at the skylight. The moonlight illuminated her pained face. The foyer looked like it belonged in a rundown castle, only the moon and Alice seemed more vivid than the reality. Where did her strength come from? Sotaro stared at her. Without understanding the significance of Alice's gaze, he turned towards the night sky, powerless as it was. For the third time that night, the silence was broken by the sound of the phone ringing. Before Shojiro could move, a thin shadow bolted across the foyer. By the time he realized that it was the weakened Alice, she had already taken the receiver in her hand.
青子
It was the first time Shojiro had heard Alice sound concerned. Her tone was admittedly graver than when was enduring her own pain. Alice's question received only a short response from the voice on the other end. It was a voice more frail than Alice's, like a flickering flame about to turn to smoke.
ごめんやられた
The phone was far from Shojiro's ear, but the words he picked up were very unlikely. Not like her. Despite saying so little, no, because she had said so little. The weight of Aoko's defeat struck Shojiro hard. Alice silently set the receiver down. Only moments before her body had begun fighting the pain, now it felt stronger than ever. It was like a scarecrow transforming into a beautiful stone statue. Seeing this, Shojiro finally understood. Alice's expression when she looked up at the moon had come from her trying to accept the immutable reality. Yay! We finished a chapter! Hurrah! This is why it's called Witch in the Holy Night, because it takes place on Christmas Eve! oh, thank you so much for joining us. We're starting to get into the end game, I believe, but there is still, as you can see from the archive in here, as you can see, there's still quite a bit to read after we are done with the main scenario. So, I will see you all next time, and for that I hope you have a very good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is. Alright. Bye everybody, see you next time. Bye!